Christmas Eve in Carnation, Washington, a small, quiet town about 25 miles from Seattle. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and where neighbors still wave to each other in the mornings. The air was crisp that December night in 2007, thick with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Fairy lights flickered on porches. Inside warm homes, families gathered, children whispered about Santa Claus, and presents were tucked carefully under trees. It was a night that should have been filled with joy, peace, and love. But inside one home, a modest property surrounded by towering trees at the end of a gravel road, something else was building, a darkness. Quiet, patient, and unstoppable. Wayne and Judy Anderson had always been the heart of the family, kind, hardworking, generous. Wayne, a retired Boeing worker, was the strong but silent type. Judy, warm and nurturing, held the family together like glue. They had two children, Scott, the older son, who had built a quiet life of his own nearby with his wife Erica, and their two young children, Olivia and Nathan. Then there was Michelle, the youngest, a daughter who had always felt distant, overlooked, unfairly treated. At least that's how she saw it. Michelle had grown up in the same loving home, but her view of things was twisted, hardened over years. To her, the kindness her parents showed others was favoritism. The attention her brother got felt like betrayal. And when it came to money, she believed she had been shortchanged her entire life. In reality, the Andersons had helped her countless times, but in Michelle's eyes, it was never enough. Nothing was. She wasn't alone in her resentment. By her side was Joseph McEnroe, her boyfriend, a quiet man with a sarcastic wit, low confidence, and an odd dependency on Michelle. They weren't married, didn't have kids, and didn't have jobs either. Living rent-free on property owned by her parents, they survived largely on handouts. But instead of being grateful, their feelings had soured into a slow, simmering hatred. Every holiday gathering, every family conversation seemed to deepen that bitterness. And so, that Christmas Eve, as the rest of the country wrapped gifts and sang carols, Michelle and Joseph were doing something very different. They were loading guns. They were going over a plan. And they were walking down a driveway that led not to holiday cheer, but to cold-blooded murder. They knocked on the door just before evening. Wayne and Judy weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. This was family. Their daughter and her boyfriend had come to spend time together before the others arrived. It was Christmas Eve, after all. What parent wouldn't open the door? Inside the cozy living room with its warm lights and quiet peace, the first shots rang out. Joseph pulled the trigger first. The bullet struck Wayne in the head, then Judy. The sound was deafening, but the woods around the house muffled. There were no screams, just two bodies crumpled to the floor, blood staining the Christmas rug beneath them. It was sudden, shocking, and cruel, and it was only the beginning. Michelle and Joseph didn't leave. They didn't run. Instead, they waited, sat in the house, calm, calculating. They knew who was coming next. Scott Anderson, Michelle's brother, was bringing his wife and kids to celebrate Christmas Eve. He had no idea that his parents were already dead in the living room. No idea that the house he'd soon enter was a tomb. And as the sun set and the lights outside glowed a little brighter, a family of four made their way toward a nightmare. The Anderson house stood silent now, except for the low hum of Christmas lights still glowing on the tree and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. Outside, snow had started to fall lightly. Inside, Wayne and Judy lay lifeless, their blood slowly drying on the floor. And sitting only feet away were their killers, Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe, waiting. Not hiding, not nervous, waiting. Joseph paced a little, hands occasionally trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still pulsing through him. Michelle sat stiffly, almost cold, as if her mind was already steps ahead. They had a plan. They had told themselves this was necessary, that this was justice, that this was revenge. But mostly, they had convinced themselves that this was the only way. It was a little past 5 p.m. when Scott Anderson's car pulled into the driveway. The tires crackled over the gravel as Olivia and Nathan bounced excitedly in the back seat. Erica smiled at them through the rearview mirror, unaware of what they were about to walk into. Scott had grown up in this house. He knew the land, the air, the feel of that long path up to the porch. It was home. He noticed the door was unlocked, not unusual in Carnation. especially on Christmas Eve. When they stepped inside, everything seemed oddly quiet. No smells of food cooking, no music, just the low hum of house lights and a strange tension in the air. Joseph greeted them first. His voice was steady, forced. Michele followed, trying to sound normal. Scott was confused, asking where Mom and Dad were. Then the lies began. "They had to run out real quick," Michele said, eyes darting. "They'll be back soon." Scott looked around. Something was off. The decorations were in place, the gifts under the tree, but it was like the soul of the house was missing. No warmth, no energy, just a strange hollowness. Erica held Olivia's hand as Nathan toddled in behind her. She said something about starting to unwrap a few presents early. That was the plan. The kids were excited. But that moment, that last little slice of innocence, was shattered within seconds. Joseph pulled out the gun again. There was no warning, no dramatic declaration, just the sound of metal and the cold reality of gunfire as bullets ripped into Scott. He fell hard. Erica screamed and tried to shield the children. She ran toward the hallway, clutching Olivia and pushing Nathan ahead. Michele chased after her, grabbing at the kids. Joseph fired again. Erica went down. Olivia screamed. A high, terrified sound that echoed in the hallway. Nathan, barely 3, stood frozen. What happened next is the part of the story that most people, even the detectives who heard every word of the confession, couldn't forget. Joseph later told police that Olivia, just 5 years old, looked at him and begged for her life. "No, don't," she had cried. "I'm sorry." But he pulled the trigger anyway. And then he turned to Nathan. Another shot, another life gone. When it was over, the house was completely still. 6 people, all members of the same family, dead, shot in cold blood by 2 people who were supposed to love them. Joseph and Michele didn't flee immediately. They cleaned, wiped blood, tried to cover the mess with towels. They moved the bodies into positions that seemed less gruesome, as if trying to undo what had just been done, as if death could be rearranged into something more acceptable. They dragged Wayne and Judy's bodies into a shed outside the house. Scott and Erica's bodies were left inside. The children were wrapped in blankets, as though that might somehow preserve their innocence, as if Michele, even in the aftermath of murder, was still trying to feel like a sister, or a daughter, or maybe just a human being. But it was too late for any of that, and still, they didn't call the police. They didn't drive away screaming in panic. They returned to their home, the trailer on the Andersons' property, and waited. They thought about what to do next, whether to lie, whether to vanish, whether to try and stage the whole scene as something else. But even in their delusion, they knew this wasn't going to go unnoticed for long, because in less than 48 hours, someone else would be looking for the Anderson family. And when that knock came at the door, the entire horror of what had happened on that Christmas Eve would begin to unravel, piece by piece. 2 days passed. On the morning of December 26th, a woman named Amanda, Wayne and Judy's daughter-in-law, drove to the Anderson property. She hadn't heard from them on Christmas, which was strange. There were no return calls, no signs of life. Something didn't sit right with her, so she got in her car and made the drive up the gravel road. When she arrived, everything looked normal. The house was quiet. The car was there, the porch lights still on. But no one came to the door. She knocked. Nothing. She pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. What she found inside was a scene that would haunt her forever. The silence hit her first, that unnerving, unnatural silence. Then the smell, and then the sight. Blood. On the floor, on the walls, on the furniture. Amanda backed out of the house in horror, her voice trembling as she dialed 911. The recording of her call is chilling. In a hushed, panic-stricken voice, she tells the operator, "There are bodies in the house. I think they're all dead. I don't know what happened. Please send someone." Within minutes, King County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the property. They moved in cautiously, uncertain of what they would find. No one expected what lay inside. They found 4 bodies in the house: Scott, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan. The positions of the bodies made it immediately clear this wasn't a robbery or a break-in. It was personal, cold, systematic. Out back, in the shed, they found Wayne and Judy. The entire family, all 3 generations, wiped out in one night. Investigators secured the scene. News of the massacre spread quickly, but few details were released at first. Police weren't yet sure who had done it. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of strangers. It felt internal, as if the killer had been someone close, someone who knew the family, someone who'd been trusted. The deputies didn't need to push very hard. Michele Anderson, standing in the doorway of her small trailer, just a short walk from the blood-soaked house, didn't protest. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't deny anything. Her voice was flat. Her eyes were heavy. And what she said next made every officer in the room stop cold. "We did it," she said quietly. "We killed them." The room fell silent. The confession wasn't screamed. It wasn't dramatic. It came out like a fact, like she was reading from a grocery list. Joseph stood behind her, his face pale and blank. He looked like a man watching the world collapse in slow motion. He didn't say anything, but he didn't run either. It was as if whatever strength they had used to carry out the murders had all but vanished now. At the police station, the interrogation rooms were lit with cold, sterile light. Cameras rolled, tape recorders clicked, and then the full story began to spill out. First came Michele. She sat across from detectives with her arms crossed, not crying, not panicking, just explaining, like she was walking them through a routine. She told them that the plan had been hers, that she had been angry for years, that she felt abandoned by her family, emotionally and financially. She believed her parents had always favored Scott, always given him more attention, more money, more love. When the detectives asked her why she hadn't just left, moved away, cut ties, tried to rebuild her life, her answer was chillingly simple. They had to pay. She said she wanted them all gone. Not just her parents, not just her brother, but the whole family. Everyone, the kids included. When the detectives pressed her on the children, Olivia and Nathan, asking why them, she just looked down. "They would have told," she said. Her voice didn't break. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't flinch. Then it was Joseph's turn. His story aligned with hers, but his demeanor was different. He was nervous, twitchy, like someone finally facing the weight of what he'd done. He admitted that he was the one who pulled the trigger in almost every killing. That Michele had planned it, pushed it, told him what to do, but it had been his finger on the trigger. He said he had looked into Olivia's eyes before he shot her. He remembered her begging him not to do it, and then he said he did it anyway. There was a long pause after that. One of the detectives asked, "Did you feel anything?" Joseph stared at the table. "I felt like I had to," he said. The officers looked at each other. They weren't sure if that was cowardice or something darker. A mind disconnected from consequence, from humanity. Over the course of the next few hours, more details emerged. They had discussed the plan for weeks beforehand. They had gone target shooting to prepare. They had picked Christmas Eve deliberately, knowing the whole family would be together, knowing the timing would allow them to get everyone in one place. They had waited in that house with the bodies of Wayne and Judy, while Scott and Erica were on their way, sitting with the blood still fresh, with the tree still lit, pretending they were just guests arriving early. And after it was all done, they went home and watched television, ate, slept, for 2 days. The interviews were long, emotional, sometimes hard to even sit through for the officers in the room, but every minute added more pieces to the puzzle. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't random. It was planned, executed, carried out with intention, and the thing that made it all so hard to process, so gut-wrenching, was the reason behind it, the motive. There was no inheritance, no millions of dollars, no long history of abuse or torment. There was just resentment, pettiness, bitterness about money, about feeling ignored, about not getting enough attention. Michele told them she believed her parents were going to cut her off, that they didn't respect her, that they never listened, and that, in her words, they needed to learn a lesson. But they never would. Because Michele made sure of that, the interviews ended and both Michele and Joseph were formally arrested. Charged with 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, no bail, No chance of leaving the station except in cuffs. Outside, the press had started to swarm. Word had spread like wildfire. An entire family murdered in one night, allegedly by their own daughter and her boyfriend. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, something no one could imagine happening in real life. But in Carnation, Washington, it had. And now, the community, the police, and the entire state were about to face the fallout. The news broke on December 27, 2007. At first, the headlines were cautious. 6 bodies found in Carnation home on Christmas Eve. Possible family tragedy under investigation. But it didn't take long before the full horror began to spill out. And when the names came with it, everything changed. Wayne and Judy Anderson, Scott and Erica Anderson, Olivia, age 5, Nathan, just 3, and then in bold, unforgiving black print beneath them, the names of the accused. Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe, the daughter, the boyfriend. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The town of Carnation, a quiet rural community where Christmas was still a holiday of church bells, hand-wrapped gifts, and potlucks with neighbors, was now the epicenter of one of the most brutal family massacres in Washington state history. News vans flooded the town. Reporters stood in front of the Anderson home, their breath visible in the cold December air as they delivered updates to a stunned audience across the country. Candlelight vigils appeared within hours. People from churches, schools, and nearby towns came together, holding hands, crying for a family most of them had never met, but now felt deeply connected to. But behind the scenes, prosecutors were already preparing for war. They saw a woman who had long felt ignored, underappreciated, mentally unstable. They saw a man, Joseph, who might have been manipulated, coerced, pulled into something he wasn't emotionally prepared for. Still, even those arguments were hard to stomach in the court of public opinion. Because how do you justify wrapping a child in a blanket and then pulling the trigger? The town was divided between disbelief and fury. Michelle's former classmates came forward, saying they had always seen her as shy, a little distant, but never dangerous. Some remembered her as smart. Others said she had a temper, but nothing that stood out. Joseph was a mystery to most. Originally from New Mexico, he had moved to Washington with Michele and stayed mostly out of sight. No job, no friends, just her. People who did meet him said he was quiet, polite, maybe a little odd, but never violent. Now they were accused of executing a family on the holiest night of the year, and then going home like nothing had happened. Carnation didn't know how to process it. The Christmas lights still hung from rooftops, fluttering in the cold wind like a cruel reminder. The presents under some trees hadn't been opened yet, and at the Anderson house, no one would ever open them again. The property was sealed off with yellow tape. Investigators moved in and out for days, collecting every shred of evidence they could find. Blood patterns, bullet casings, the guns. The shell casings matched the weapons found in Michele and Joseph's trailer. Their fingerprints were everywhere. Their confessions were recorded. There was no mystery left. Just the chilling, unbearable truth. As 2008 began, the case became national news. TV specials aired on major networks. Crime reporters descended on Carnation. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, why it had happened, and what would happen next. But for the people who had known the Andersons, none of those questions mattered anymore. They just wanted to know how something so evil could live so close, could hide behind a familiar face, and strike without warning. And as the legal system prepared for trial, 2 chairs sat empty at the defense table, awaiting the arrival of 2 people who had already confessed, but who the world was still struggling to comprehend. The wheels of justice don't turn quickly, even when the crime is clear, even when the confessions are recorded, even when the community is crying for resolution. It takes time. For Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe, the time between arrest and trial would stretch not for weeks or months, but for years. At the beginning of 2008, prosecutors filed 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder against both the suspects. Each count came with the possibility and the intent of seeking the death penalty. That alone made the case more complex, more expensive, and more emotionally charged. Michele and Joseph were housed separately, under high security. They had no contact with one another after their arrest. Each was assigned